Yeah. But there is one subject that I would like to probably talk about, because it's something that I notice a lot of you are struggling with. So, and maybe the board might be a good way to discuss it. So
let's do it.
Yeah. So I would just like to talk to you about making this switch between dealing with everything sort of on an intellectual level to dealing with everything on an emotional level. So perhaps we should call it how I'm designed. Should we call it that? The big problem I feel a lot of people have is that we sort of lose, in childhood, due to all sorts of circumstances and conditions, we lose connection with how we're designed to function, how God designed us to function. And what we do is we start absorbing how people think we should function. So that happens during our childhood. So during our childhood, right from the beginning, you're an emotional being who's learning to use the intellect over time. But right from the beginning, you're emotional. You don't understand your emotions and you don't have much consciousness of what they're about. You just have them. And there's no other thing you do but have them. So this is why a little baby, when it's born, frequently cries quite a lot, because it's just having its feelings. And there's a build-up of feelings already that it's absorbed from its parents that it needs to have. And it just has them without any worry about them or without any concern that it's not coping or anything like that. It just has them. It doesn't judge any emotional experience. That's how you're designed to function. Then as time goes on, you have a habit of then incorporating the intellect, and then you notice also how much everybody around you responds badly to your emotions. And so what you do then is you start shutting down your emotional experience, so you stop having them. But the trouble with that is that you are working against your design. So right from that time onwards, you're working against the way you've been designed. And you can work against the way you've been designed for such a long time that by the time you're an adult, you have worked against it so much that you've forgotten how to remain connected to your emotions and have your emotional experience as it occurs. So what we're fundamentally doing is trying to change our design. Right? And this is why most of us have a lot of trouble with our feelings. It's because we've tried to change our design, and we're very dedicated to changing our design. We're very dedicated to what we feel is improving our design by being more emotionally stable, is what we call it. The problem with this is that every bit of truth you will ever absorb has to come to you emotionally. You can't absorb it intellectually. You can be presented with facts, but they're not going to enter your soul unless they become a part of your emotional state. So fundamentally, from God's standpoint, you are working not only against your design, but you're also working against knowledge. And this is why there's very little knowledge amongst adults on earth today about any matter at all. Very, very little truth about any matter. Because most of the things a person absorbs through their lifetime, they're not looking at it as a perspective of truth, they're looking at it from a perspective of what they believe is factual for their life, which is all governed by the emotions they're trying to save themselves from having. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. So once you start saving yourself from having your feelings, you now are going to close yourself down from absorbing truths. And so the situation of absorbing truths now becomes very complicated for you. And what happens over time is you become so intellectually dominant, but also so corrupted in your emotions that you think what your emotions are telling you. You're thinking you're not having emotion, but actually there's all these emotions going on underneath that are controlling what you're able to absorb. And those emotions usually are injured emotions. So they're every time we have a discrepancy with God's version of love, in other words, a disagreement with God about what love is, we create emotions that we then store that we also don't want to experience. And so we end up in this state where the only things that we can absorb that we are all the things that we believe are factual, not what is actually factual from God's perspective. Right? So an example of that is, from God's perspective, the spirit world is a fact. For most people on earth, up until the point they die, it's not a fact. It's only after they pass that it becomes a fact. But it could be considered to be a fact way before then, but because of the emotions that a person doesn't want to experience, they don't ever let it become a fact. Right? So that's an example of how we're denying a whole heap of facts. Like, every one of you is surrounded by spirits every day, all day, awake or asleep. Right? So when you're asleep, you're with spirits, and when you're awake here on earth, you're surrounded by them every day. The average person has no consciousness of that fact. And the main reason why they don't is because there's a whole heap of emotions they don't want to feel that would cause them to come to the conclusion of that fact, even though there's plenty of evidence that that is true. The same applies to God's existence. God's existence is a fact. But for most people on earth, it's not a fact. In fact, most people who have heard, and even people who are religious who have heard about God, generally still don't have a very strong idea whether God exists or not. In fact, they have many doubts all through their lives as to whether God does exist or not, because their emotions stop them from absorbing the fact. Does that make sense? So it begins in our childhood, where we're not connected to our feelings, and then as we grow, this flaw in what we create, humans create, this flaw of where we're trying to work against the design, causes us then to also work against truth, work against absorbing truths that don't come to us emotionally anymore. We can only imbibe them sort of intellectually. We can only listen to them. So this is what we find many times when we're travelling and talking to people. We find that people are fascinated by what we talk about, but they are not a fact inside of them, those things we talk about. They're just ideas, concepts. Sometimes some of you feel like good ideas or concepts, such as, you have a life after you die. That can be considered a good concept, right? Then there's other ones that many of you feel are really bad concepts, like soulmates, one person for you design sort of thing. Many of you feel that that's a really bad fact, and there's so many emotions that stop you from absorbing that fact. Right.
It's like a valve, isn't it? You're this open channel for truth to enter emotionally, but as soon as you become aware that there's an emotion that might be triggered by that truth entering you, you shut off the valve, and usually you have to use that injured emotion, don't you?
Well, then now everything's going through the injured emotion.
Yes. And it can't really enter the truth in its purity, can't really enter you.
No.
You're shutting it off. And if you're willing to feel the emotion, then the truth can flow in, and with it unimpeded. Yeah.
So you sort of need to think of yourself as, so most of us, right, think of ourselves as the body, and only the physical one, right? So we only think of ourselves as the physical body, but we're not thinking of ourselves even as having a spirit body. Most of us don't even think of that fact, and yet that body is actually more complex in its design and more high in its state of absorption of other facts than this body is. And yet this is the body we're using. We're trying to absorb everything through this. And then, of course, we're a half of a soul. Right, so I'll just draw the other half too. We're a half of a soul, and the reason why I've drawn them separate is because for most of us, the fact that we're a whole soul hasn't even occurred to us yet as an emotion. Right, so for most of us, we still think of ourselves as an individual doing things, right? An individual saying things, an individual doing things, an individual having an experience, not understanding that actually even your experience is being partially felt by the other half of your soul, even while you're having your experience right now, right? So these are sort of facts, and most of us don't absorb them because when we're focused on this body, we become, as I talked about many times, this body has become our our centre of focus in terms of our experience. Right? But if you think about the soul for a moment, in terms of how it's designed, it's really quite interesting, because if we grab this design of the soul, because the fact is, there is actually no separation in the design of the soul. Your soul is actually one complete unit. Right? Even right now, your soul is one complete unit. It cannot change from one complete unit. And the problem with it having the feeling of halves is due to the facts you don't feel emotionally. Does that make sense to you? So even the whole idea that I am an individual without my other half is an emotion that causes me automatically to believe and feel that I can't feel the other half of myself. Right? It blocks me from the facts of the other half. And this is why, for many people, they never even get to feel the other half of their soul until they're like in the fifth sphere of the spirit world. And the main reason why that is they've tried to deconstruct by that time a lot of their feelings and emotions that cause them to believe in the separation. Does that make sense to you? Of course, that's a different thing than growing into a knowledge. So an example of growing into a knowledge is when, like a little child, learns how to go from drinking milk only to eating solid food. That is a natural transition of growth, right? And you have many natural transitions of growth without you even realising it. If you think about it, you think about the time you were walking. By the time you were walking, there's already been a transition before you were crawling, and before then you couldn't even move at all, aside from somebody picking you up and moving you generally. And all of that happened as natural transitions of growth. So I'm not talking about natural transitions of growth here when I'm talking about working against your design. A natural transition of growth is a part of your design. But when you stop your natural transitions of growth, that's you working against the design. All right? So just the concept that I am an individual causes this. Ulf, you want to ask?
Even if I'm not told that I had a soulmate, how do I come to feel that I have one?
Well, your feelings would tell you. You see, if your feelings weren't inhibited by somebody externally, so in our childhood, generally what's happening is our parents already have a set of beliefs. And as you grow, you are absorbing their beliefs. And to get their approval, you need to have their same beliefs as they have. And you need to discard any beliefs you may have that are different to their beliefs. That's how you get somebody's approval generally. Now, during your childhood, you learnt to do that. And one of the beliefs you had to discard is that there's one person for you. Unless your parents believe that, you won't believe it either. So if your parents believe there is one person, then you will possibly come to absorb that as a belief. But of course there's many other things that affect your belief, including your experience at school, your experience with the opposite sex or the same sex depending on your attraction, and all of these other things govern your belief. So you could have your very first romantic experience when you're like 10, and then after that be so hurt by it that you could decide, well, I don't want to recognise this feeling of fact anymore, this fact that I knew before then. And shutting down emotional experiences we've been all trained to do. But if we didn't work against our design, you would find that by the time you're a teenager, you would know for a fact you're one half of the soul. That's a natural part of your design. In fact, God created puberty in the physical form, which only occurs, by the way, in the physical form. God created puberty to create the desire of the recognition of that fact. That's why we go through puberty, actually. The point of puberty is to bring you to the fact that you are a sexual being that has another half. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. So it's all part of your design. Now, you would understand those facts automatically by just growth if there wasn't some precluding effect. some precluding things, cause that causes the effect of you denying that truth. Makes sense? Yep. So you come to recognise those facts. But you see, unfortunately for many of us, by the time we've become even just 7 or 8 years old, so way before puberty, we've been shut down so much emotionally with a whole set of beliefs and a whole set of things we've absorbed, and also a lot of our own sin by this stage has been engaged generally. So by this stage, I am now very adverse to the facts of the universe. I'm very adverse to God's facts. I'm very adverse to His truth. And what I'm doing now is just searching for my own truth. And my own truth is very much going to be governed by how much emotionally I can cope with whatever comes at me. See, because if I can't cope with it, I'm not going to absorb it as a truth. If I can't honour it and respect it and love it, I'm not going to absorb it as a truth. So by the time I'm a teenager, let's say I've learnt to become very untrustful of people by that stage, let's say, because of my childhood experience. You will end up believing at that point that there's no one in the world you can trust. Right? Even though it's completely false. There are plenty of people in the world you can actually trust. And the more sinless a person is, the more you can trust them, actually. Right? But we won't believe that. We'll believe there's no one we can trust. Right? Because to open our heart to trust, and trust is not a work in progress, it's a condition. To open our heart to the condition where we can trust, our own feelings have to be engaged in such a way that we can trust what we feel. And to do that, we're going to have to be feeling our own feelings. And if we can't feel our own feelings, then of course we're not going to know what to trust or who to trust. And people like that generally, and there's a few of you in the room, are very analytical, and you look at everything and you look at, what's they doing there and what's going on there, and you're suspicious about everything, right? And that is coming from the fact that you can't trust anymore because the emotions that would require you to be, the emotions that you would be required to feel in order to enter the state of trust, you don't want to feel. And while you don't want to feel them, you're never going to trust anything or anybody. That makes sense? So here we are. We're already in this state where we believe the soul is that, right? So we believe that, which is not actually there. There's no real separation in the soul, really. We believe that it's there, right? And as a result of our feelings, it is there. Our feelings create our facts. Now that's very different to God's truth, God's facts. So now I'm in a state where I have a truth. There's no such thing as soulmates, as an example. And God has a truth. There is such a thing as soulmates, for example. And I can be in complete disharmony with God's truth inside of my own soul, in my own feelings. That makes sense? Yeah. So in my feelings, I'm against the whole concept or idea. Now, I can sit down and I can read about soulmates, and I can watch romantic movies, and I can read romantic books and stories, and in the end of all of that, I will still feel there's no such a thing as soulmate. I want a choice. And this is what we start to do. We start to do this. We start to choose emotion, which, by the way, is the same thing as choosing our facts, choosing our truth. You've got it? By choosing my emotions and saying some emotions I can feel and other emotions I can't, I'm now also in the state of saying, well, some truths that are related to those emotions I need to feel I can't have either. I'm precluding myself from absorbing those truths. So an example of that is, here I am, I am an eternal being, but I don't believe I am one. Right? So what do I do when I don't believe I'm one? I eat, drink and be merry because tomorrow I might die. In other words, I do a lot of things that I think are going to bring me benefit right now because tomorrow there may be no benefit, right? Because I might be dead tomorrow. So just that one emotion of me not seeing that there is a truth of my eternal existence causes me to act in so many ways that are not only out of harmony with God's truth but also sinful, they also cause me to not make good decisions and choices. And my choices are all based around what emotions I'm trying to avoid, rather than actually whether they are wise or truthful choices. Right?